Welcome to the Got Questions podcast. Well, here we are on October 28th. And as you can imagine, we get quite a few questions about Halloween. What are the origins of Halloween? What does the Bible say about ghosts and hauntings and all sorts of creatures of the night? To what degree is Halloween a demonic holiday? Doesn't it come from All Saints Day, All Souls Day, Samhain? I don't know if I'm even pronouncing that correctly, but all those type of questions. But ultimately, they all have the same element to them, which is, to what degree should Christians participate in or celebrate Halloween? Can Halloween be redeemed? And we get similar questions related to Christmas, related to Easter, because all three of the holidays, to varying degrees, have some pagan elements that have been incorporated in the holidays. Well, Halloween, of course, is the worst of the three by far in terms of the pagan origins. And yet, the whole thing that Halloween is probably most famous for, dressing up in costumes, as best as we can tell, comes from a Christian holiday. All Saints Day, which again, when you're trying to figure out what it actually mean to people 400 years ago, you're going to have mixed results. But the predominant viewpoint seems to be that people dressed in these things essentially to mock the things of darkness, to mock Satan and spiritual warfare type of concepts. It was a Christian celebration. And then even the Reformation actually occurred on, I think, October 31st, November 1st. And so there's a Reformation Day that part of that celebration as well. So there, despite the overwhelming pagan influence, despite many aspects of Halloween that we should absolutely, definitely avoid and have no part of, there are some Christian elements to it that I don't think should be easily dismissed. So Kevin, why don't you start us off? How should Christians view Halloween?
Well, how they should view Halloween, it might be different from how do they view Halloween, which there are a lot of different opinions, a lot of, even in my own church. I mean, people pretty much run the gamut of how they approach Halloween, and I'm very aware of that. I try to be very careful and not be offending any particular person in my church regarding this controversial holiday. But basically, there are three different perspectives that a Christian can use in approaching Halloween. One is rejection. You just reject the holiday altogether. You want nothing to do with it. On trick-or-treat night, you're home with the porch light off and you don't answer the door. Or sometimes the rejection takes the form of a replacement. So we're going to have a fall festival instead. We're going to have a Reformation Day celebration, as you mentioned, Shay, which is an entirely appropriate thing to be celebrating, the Reformation. And so some people will go that route. And so they avoid any Halloween type stuff, but they say this is Reformation Day and they'll celebrate that. And then there is the acceptance of Halloween and various levels of embracing the holiday. Just Christians who see it as a fun time, a harmless time of fun, family type stuff. And of course, they're going to be avoiding the more gruesome, the macabre, the morbid aspects of Halloween. But, as far as, taking the kids out trick-or-treating and welcoming visitors to your porch to hand out candy, they're all in favor of that. Halloween parties at church or at school or whatever. And so that's, just an acceptance of the holiday. Then there is the redemption perspective. You seeing the holiday as an opportunity to do something for Christ. So evangelism comes into play in a lot of cases. This is a great time to evangelize. You've got people from the neighborhood that are coming up to your house. Why not use this time to hand out some tracts along with the candy to present the gospel in some way? I know families that when the kids come to get their candy on their front porch, they'll have a prayer with those kids. Just being the aroma of Christ during the Halloween time. So seeing that God, Jesus can make all things new. Let's do that with Halloween. Let's give it some new meaning. Let's use this time for the glory of God. And I kind of fall into that third category of redemption of Halloween. I accept the fact that there is the holiday, that it is very popular in the world, and so let's use that for the glory of God. My church participates in the community trunk or treat, so we'll have a vehicle at the city park coming up on Halloween night, and we'll have the trunk open, and we'll be handing out candy and tracts. So we've got the bags, the little goodie bags, already made and ready to hand out. So it's going to be filled with the goodies and a gospel track in each one. And then people from our church are there. Our church has a presence, and we are trying to use this for the glory of God. So we accept the holiday. There's a difference between celebrating the holiday and participating in it. We choose to participate because there's not a whole lot to celebrate with Halloween, but you participate on various levels, and we choose to participate by handing out tracts.
I think participation is a good way to think of it. It's different than other holidays that have origins that are questionable. So it's definitely something that needs a little more discernment. And every Christian is going to come down to what level of effort they want to put into it. Some of us obviously put in very little effort given the choice. But Halloween is like a lot of other things in our culture where there are some nominally pagan aspects to it. It really did originally come from, the core of it really did come from a Christian concept of celebrating saints. That's why it's All Hallows Eve or All Saints Day Eve. And the ideas of dressing up and pretending to be saints and things like that. And as was mentioned, sort of the idea of sort of mocking evil and Satan and saying, haha, we're going to win. And then when the Celtic aspects started to move more into popular culture, that's where you started to see some more of the concepts of like spirits wandering the earth or carving turnips and pumpkins and things like that to make candles that would keep the dead away and stuff like that. So that's where people talk about the pagan holiday, which is a Samhain, which is the one that everybody associates with Celtic origins and Satanism and all this other stuff. And it really isn't. It really had more to do with Celtic folklore and traditions, things like that. But I think it's important for Christians to remember that we want to be careful about the standard that we set for things like this. It's totally fine for somebody to say, I don't want to participate in something that seems like I'm endorsing paganism. But we also have to remember that there's a lot of things in our culture that have ultimately pagan origins. Some of them are actually flat out superstitions that some Christians think of as being not only normal, but almost obligatory. When somebody sneezes and you say, bless you, we're conditioned to think of that as something that's almost a polite requirement. Like it's sort of rude to not say that in some circumstances, but that's from a superstition of the idea that if you don't say bless you, the person's, losing some part of their soul of their blessing. There's the idea of covering your mouth when you yawn. It's the same thing. There's a little bit of an element of politeness, but there was also a superstition that when somebody yawns, that's, you're letting, again, sort of like the bless you, a piece of yourself get out. Wedding rings are an example of that. Those actually have their origins in Egyptian and Roman concepts of love and spirituality. But I don't know of anybody who wears wedding rings and then thinks, I'm not going to wear the wedding ring because somebody somewhere somehow had this connected to paganism. We know what it means now. We know what we're doing with it now. And there's sometimes we can't get away from things that have pagan associations. We've named all the planets after false pagan deities. The days of the week that we use, at least here in the West, all have names connected to pagan deities. You have Tiamat, you have Woden, you have Thor, you have Freya. Those are the names that we use for that. I'm not honoring Thor when I talk about Thor's Day or Thursday. Now, the difference that's worth pointing out, obviously, is that yes, there's a more of an overt sense of it to Halloween, and that's where the discernment becomes a little trickier. If you get wrapped up in the commercialism of Christmas, that's not a good thing. But even then, if you're going a little crazy with the gifts and the decorations and things like that, that's not explicitly unchristian or anti-Christian. But there are some things of Halloween that people celebrate or they lean into that really are unchristian or anti-Christian. So it doesn't work for a believer to say, well, yeah, I know it's pagan, but I'm not celebrating it as pagan, when they're dressed up as a serial killer and, giggling about the idea of murdering people or things like that, glorying in the wickedness and the gore and the suffering and the death and the spirits and things like that. That's a very different thing. So believers need to be able to gauge this carefully, but we have to be able to do it honestly. So we don't want to set standards and then find out that we're tripped up with our own hypocrisy and saying, well, if I'm going to take that tactic, then I have to take this. You go to a courthouse, you see a statue of a blind woman holding scales and usually a sword. That's directly derived from Greek, Roman, pagan ideas of a sort of a spirit or an embodiment of law and justice. Do we not go to courthouses because of things like that? Here again, we can all draw our lines. Some people hear things like that and they go, oh no, I guess it means I can't do those things anymore. For me and my family, we kind of lean into the redemption participation side of things. My kids like to dress up in costumes and go trick-or-treating, but they've not asked because I think it's just sort of an instinct that we don't do things like, blood-drenched demons and wicked evil things like that. They're going as cartoon characters or superheroes or memes and stereotypes of cowboys and stuff like that. That's really where my kids are in that. I mean, I've used to dress up sometimes before. I mean, right now I'm in that phase, but I remember one of my favorite costumes I did was I don't know if we can say this because of the whole copyright thing. I'm sure we can for fair use, but the bad cop, good cop from the Lego movie. Relatively harmless kind of a thing. It was fun. It was interesting. So for me, I feel comfortable with that side of things. And I agree with Kevin that it also gives an opportunity to talk about where we draw the lines and why we draw the lines. So if somebody's asking, just for example, what do you think of this or what do you think of that? Well, that's my opportunity to say, well, I'm not comfortable with that because of what it means or because of what it does. So I can participate knowing what I mean by it and also be careful that I don't send people signals that give them the wrong impression of what I'm doing.
Yeah. So, Kevin, you did a great job of outlining the three main positions on this, and those are definitely what we hear most often. And it's interesting how, other than the extreme have no part, hide in your house with all the lights off perspective, the other two are very amenable to allowing people to agree to disagree on the day. That if you choose not to observe, that's fine, but don't judge us when we decide to attempt to redeem the day. But that's really difficult when you're convinced that a certain day is absolutely of the devil. And some people are so convinced of that. I would never seek to change their mind on it. I would maybe challenge their thinking here and there, but truly, based on what I read in like Romans 14, let each person be fully convinced in their own mind. Whatever is not of faith is of sin. If you are not fully convinced that you should participate, you shouldn't. But if you are fully convinced you can use it for the glory of God, you should. And I think that's a really healthy perspective, but it's really difficult for a lot of people to get there. And then, Jeff, I love what you shared about the pagan origins of things, whether it's the days of the week, the planets, so many different things. And I couldn't find the original quote. Someone told me at one point that archaeologists believe that the wheel was originally invented to allow easier transport of animal and or human sacrifices to pagan altars. So does that mean we can't use wheels? It's just like, if anything that had a pagan origin means we can never use it in any way, well, that's going to eliminate virtually everything we do on a daily basis, because everything at some point has been used for evil purposes. So it's difficult to have that attitude and then apply it consistently. And that's what we try to see. Again, I have no desire. I've never in my life encouraged anyone to participate in Halloween any day. But what I try to get people to understand, think through this, allow grace for other people to have a different perspective than you, and then don't judge them. Allow God to, if you think someone's wrong, speak the truth in love, and then ask God to change that person's heart. Don't make it your mission in life to, I'm going to shut down the national celebration of Halloween all on my own. That's
Hmm.
not going to happen. You're going to lose that battle. But speaking the truth in love, if you think someone is embracing the day further than they should, pray for that person. Speak the truth in love and allow God to do the work. But truly, if they are a believer, if they are observing Halloween in a way that's not God honoring, God will eventually bring that conviction. Allow Him to do that work instead of making it your mission in life to defeat Halloween all by yourself.
We have to have discernment, and that word's been mentioned a couple times here already. We have passages like Ephesians 5, where we are not to take part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them, reprove them. And so, as we wrestle with these types of issues, we do need to be asking ourselves: Are we participating in an unfruitful work? Are we aiding and abetting the forces of darkness,
Hmm.
or are we doing our part to bring the light? And I think that goes into those levels of participation and redemption of the day. And I'm glad that you also mentioned Romans 14, Shay, with the whole aspect of Christian liberty, because that does come into play. Um, Scripture does not allow us to bind other people by
Right.
our conscience. Um, so we've got to be careful with this too. If there's someone who avoids Halloween, they are not scripturally. They should not be judging another believer who is participating in Halloween and handing out tracts. Maybe even in costume, tossing out the candy and the gospel. And it works the other way too. The one who is participating in Halloween and trying to redeem the day, that person's not allowed to be judgmental of the one who is totally avoiding the holiday. There needs to be a mutual respect, and again, let each be fully convinced in his own mind. Matters of conscience in these gray areas is an important thing. I also approach, just personally, I approach this whole thing by remembering a few things. One is I acknowledge the pagan origins of the day. I understand that there's a lot about Halloween that is not good, and it is traced back to some paganism and some, superstitions and beliefs in spirits and the dead walking among us and praying for the dead and things like that. And those types of things can't be ignored. Those roots have to be acknowledged, and so there are some things about Halloween that we need to avoid as believers. At the same time, I also acknowledge that there are non-sinful aspects of Halloween. And so, like dressing up in a costume, there's nothing inherently wrong about that. Um, Pretending to be another character, for fun, is 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 nothing inherently wrong with that. Giving out candy, bobbing for apples, whatever the celebration involves, there's nothing wrong with a lot of these things. Plus, as I've mentioned before, Halloween provides for my family, my household, a wonderful opportunity for evangelism. My church is involved with that as well. And I also want to remember this, that how we represent Christ matters. So this will make a difference in, what type of costume I pick. I'm not going to be I'm not going to be choosing an axe murderer to be portraying. I'm not going to be doing the demons and all those kind of things. If I choose to dress up, it's going to be something that's going to be appropriate for a believer and probably be furthering the gospel message, something that's going to allow me to have a platform to reach others, remembering that I'm going to be representing Christ in my community. So, how we interact with people on Halloween matters. Our costume choices matter. So, I think in the end, I think every believer is responsible to search the scriptures, to pray for wisdom, and then to make the decision for the godly choice that their conscience would lead them to after studying the scriptures and praying for wisdom. And with all that said, happy Halloween.
It's also important to remember that there are some aspects that people get down on for Halloween that not necessarily are bad in and of themselves. Celebration of things like death and gore and things like that is obviously not a good thing, but fear is a human experience, and it's okay sometimes to explore the things that scare us, or why do we think of those that way. Some of us embrace those things, some of us don't care for those things. But for me, for example, the genre of horror that's associated with Halloween is another one of those complicated topics where good horror, redeemable horror, or non-profane horror, we could say it that way, is the sort of thing that does exactly that. It explores how do we process things like guilt, fear, discomfort, and things like that. And it provides opportunities to say, how do we process that experience from a Christian worldview or a non-Christian worldview? Bad horror, or is the stuff that's basically just torture porn, where where it's just blood and nudity and guts and human suffering and things like that. That is not the kind of thing that I have any interest in, and I don't really think other believers should be particularly interested in either. But it's possible for us to explore some of these themes. Just because a story is eerie or unsettling or creepy or whatever else doesn't necessarily mean that it's un-Christian, especially if you're willing to go through and look at it. You can even have aspects of stories that we can admit right off the bat are technically incompatible with the Bible, but as long as we recognize that they're fiction, a great example of that is Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. As believers, we don't actually believe that God's going to send ghosts to communicate with people. We don't believe that he's actually going to let a person see their future and then make a change in their future the way it happens in there. But there's very Christian themes in A Christmas Carol. So as long as we have the acknowledgement of what is and what is not, I think it's okay. And that's another place where different believers are going to have their own individual lines. Some Christians are going to come down and be very uncomfortable with those things. Some are going to say, I'm okay with it. And I'm glad that we've been talking about the Christian liberty thing. It is true that the pagan or the negative associations with Halloween are obviously much more overt than they are in other places. And we're not being facetious or silly when we talk about things like wheels and wedding rings and things like that. We understand that absolutely nobody in the modern world thinks that I'm honoring Egyptian paganism when I wear a ring. I'm aware of that. So we do need to be careful with that. And that's where on the Christian liberty side, we do have to remember that there are other people and other believers that we have to be careful about the signals that we send. So if my celebration of Halloween in some way encourages somebody who the Bible would say is a weaker brother, and I'm encouraging them to violate their conscience and maybe get into things that they don't necessarily think they're comfortable with, that's a problem. So as much as it's okay for me to say I am comfortable with A, B, and C of Halloween, but not X, Y, and Z, I still need to be careful that when I have that A, B, and C, that I am not participating in those in a way that confuses or tempts or bothers another Christian believer.
I've got to say, Jeff, that spider is creeping me out right there.
What spider?
I appreciate the fact that you brought up the good horror versus bad horror, because this is a true thing in literature. You mentioned Charles Dickens. My mind goes to Edgar Allan Poe.
Yep.
Now, my wife cannot stand Poe, but as a former literature teacher, I love Poe. And I can't say that all of his stories do this, but some of them do. Some of his stories are quite eerie, quite terrifying even, and yet they are grounded in a what amounts to a biblical worldview. The Telltale Heart, for example. What an explanation, what an exploration of guilt. And the proverb in Scripture says, "The righteous flee when no man pursues." Well,
Yep.
that is illustrated so well in that story. Um, the workings of guilt on a conscience and what evil does to a person, and it's just it's a fascinating study. And so we don't want to just throw out everything just because it's creepy or whatever. There are valid explorations of fear and guilt and how we process those things. And so, yes, that goes right along with the Halloween theme too.
Yeah. Excellent points, both of you. It's interesting. Like all three of us we're saying the same things about the same things. To try to tie it up all together. No, number one, we're not encouraging you one way or the other on Halloween. I'd say James 1:5, ask God for wisdom. Like, Lord, what, if anything, would you have me to do with Halloween? Would you have me to avoid it entirely? Would you have me to attempt to redeem the day in some way, handing out gospel tracts? I'm trying to be a light to the community, community outreach events, church events, so many things. We're not advising you in any particular direction. Ask God for wisdom. And then secondarily, based on Romans 14, other passages of Scripture, be gracious to people who have different convictions than you on this. Do not seek to divide with your brothers and sisters in Christ just because they happen to take a more liberal or more restrictive view of Halloween. I mean, truly, this is not something we should be judging our brother on. I know Christians who I think take Halloween way too far in a direction I am definitely not comfortable, and I have expressed that to them. But at that point, I leave it between them and God. I don't make it something I divide over or separate from them as a result. And I think that's the biblical attitude on this. Clearly, you hear all three of us saying there are parts of Halloween Christians should have absolutely nothing to do with. And the degree to which we can redeem the day, use it for Christ, use it for evangelism, that is the question. And that's the question that we invite each and every, all of our listeners, the viewers of this podcast episode, ask God for wisdom, seek his will, and follow his lead.
Yeah, if there's ways to redeem, I think redemption is good. And, Kevin, to your point about Angela, for example, it would be wrong to say, but you don't understand how great Poe is. You have to read this. And to just pressure and pressure and pressure and pressure.
Exactly. And I do not do that for that very reason.
Yep. Because I don't want, another example would be somebody like H.P. Lovecraft. Those who are familiar with Lovecraft, he was a guy writing in the 1920s. He wrote a lot of cosmic horror. He was also a flaming racist. So there's a lot of stuff about that that's not good. I don't read it because I really enjoy the sense of foreboding and dread, but it's interesting to me to read the sort of things that come out of a worldview that says, what would it be like if, the world really did have these awful, terrible things going on? But other people hear Lovecraft and they go, I don't want anything to do with that. That's great. I don't encourage those people to, go into and do that thing. If somebody asks me, or if I happen to mention in conversation, I may say something along those lines that, I think there's some interesting theological discussions to have in this. But once somebody basically says, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that, then it's time to just back off, be careful about it and not push somebody so that I'm giving them the wrong impression or that I'm forcing them to do something that's going to violate their conscience.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff. Excellent point. Don't violate your conscience. Don't violate someone else's conscience. Don't push or pull on this issue. Seek God's will for yourself, your family, how you should observe and participate or abstain entirely. And then allow others to come to their own convictions, trusting that God is leading them as well. So I hope our conversation today has been helpful for you, help understanding. We didn't go in too much into the origins and so forth, but ultimately that's not the issue. The issue is, what is the day today? In what ways should we absolutely not participate? In what ways can we possibly participate? This is a matter of wisdom, discernment, grace, and freedom in Christ. So hope our conversation today about Halloween has been helpful to you. As always, you can come to the website. We have several articles on Halloween discussing some of these issues in more depth, and we're happy to answer your questions that way. Got questions? The Bible has answers, and we'll help you find them.